Okay, folks, and we're on to 8.8. We're skipping 8.7 for now, so we're moving on to 8.8. 8.8 is my favorite section, but it's a little weird at first. So the whole idea is, scroll down to it. So you're not allowed to take square roots of negatives, right? So in math, you can kind of create new maths, if that even makes sense. So you say, hey, here's a new idea. Let's create a new math world. Let's say the square root of -1 actually exists, and we're just going to call it I for imaginary. You're like, okay, that's weird. So in 410A, they give you the square root of -121. And normally you would say, oh, you can't take square roots of negatives, I'm done, no real number. But now, in this new world, we can. So we call it the complex number system, and we call I, it's usually like for imaginary. Okay, so isn't this just the square root of 121 times the square root of -1? And the square root of -121, or the square root of 121 is 11, and the square root of -1 we agreed to just call I. Okay. B, square root of -1. Oh, that's just I. Okay. Boom, that was easy. C, square root of -20. Well, let's pull out, let's call this the square root of 20 times the square root of -1. And 20, remember, let's break it apart. Let's call it rad 4, rad 5. And then that -1, let's just call it I right now. Square root of 4 is 2. So 2, radical 5, I. So again, we're just building on everything we've known. Okay. Let's try 418. Says 6 plus 2i plus 3 minus 4i. So I, just think of it like a variable. So there's 6 plus 3 is 9. 2i plus a minus 4i minus 2i. Okay. So adding and subtracting those, no big deal. 430. But what is it? Don't overthink it. Just go with that right for right now. 430. 2i. Oh, I guess we need to introduce something first. We said that we're just going to let the square root of -1 be I, right? Square root of -1 is I. So if someone ever brought up the idea of I squared, that's just I times I, which is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. So if you look at it like that, this number times this number, square root, is just going to give us -1. So I squared is just -1. So I is just always I, which is that, but I squared turns into -1. What? Okay. Confusing, I know. 2i times -3 plus 4i. So that distribute, no big deal. -6i plus 8i squared. Just distributing. And then we agreed a second ago that I squared is really -1. So this is -6i plus 8 times -1, which is just a -8. And then we have the minus 6i. I'm going to just put it over there because I'm lazy. Ta-da! And technically speaking, whenever you have number stuff and I stuff, you're supposed to put the I stuff next. So the book probably mentions to write your answers as A plus BI or A minus BI. See, the A is the number stuff, then the other number, then the I stuff. So it looks pretty like that. Okay, let's try 434. So 434, we're just going to FOIL No big deal. 434. Negative 2 minus 5i. And then negative 4 plus 3i. So FOIL, firsts, negative 2 times negative 4 is 8. Outsides, negative 2 into 3i is a negative 6i. Insides, negative 5i, negative 5, negative 4 is positive 20i. And then last, minus 5, positive 3 is minus 15i squared. Okay. And then remember, I squared is really just a negative 1, this whole thing right here. So that's going to be, so if that's a minus 1, minus 1 times 15, that just becomes a plus 15. 8 minus 6 plus 20, that's plus 14i. 8 and 15, 23, plus 14i. Okay. In 437 and 439, like 437, it says 3 plus 4i squared. So just write 3 plus 4i times 3 plus 4i. No big deal. Okay. And the following multiply. Okay. So now, let's jump down to, so everything's pretty straightforward. 454. Remember, multiplying conjugates is easy. Conjugates. 6 minus 5i times its conjugate, 6 plus 5i. So when you FOIL, because it's conjugates, outsides and insides cancel. So just believe that's going to happen. So 6 times 6 is 36, minus, and then 5i times 5i is 25i squared. So far, so good. And then I squared is really negative 1. Negative 25 times a negative 1 makes it positive. 36 plus 25. Can I do that in my head? Sad. 36 plus 25. 61. Okay. So conjugates make life easy. And notice also that conjugates, when you multiply the conjugates, the I stuff disappeared. Oh, okay, interesting. Because in the next type of problem, 458, they do this. 5 minus 2i over 2 plus 5i. And they say you're not allowed to have negatives downstairs or radicals or the letter I. How do we get rid of the letter I? We multiply by the conjugate. Okay, so I need to multiply by the conjugate. So 2 minus 5i. And if I multiply the bottom by 2 minus 5i, I need to multiply the top by the same thing, 2 minus 5i. See? Conjugate, those two. Now the bottom should be easy. That's going to give us 2 times 2 is 4. 5i times 5i is 25i squared. I squared is negative 1, so that makes it a plus 25. Plus 4 is 29. Okay, so far so good. And now the top, those are not conjugates, so I'm going to have to actually FOIL. Okay, 2 times 5, 10. Outsides, minus 25i. Insides, minus 4i. Lasts. Yikes. 10i squared. I squared is negative 1, so that becomes like a negative 10. So it's like a 10 minus 25 minus 29. I minus 10, losing my voice. Minus 29i, because those cancel. So minus 29i. Oh, the 29's cancel. And so we just get minus I. Ta-da! Okay. What about 4? So if it's a binomial on bottom, it's easy. So 466, you have 4 plus 3i over 7i. So how do we get rid of the I? Let's just multiply. So it's not a binomial, but there is just a random I downstairs. One thing you could do is just multiply sort of by like an I over I, because that'll give us 4I plus 3I squared. But more importantly, the bottom becomes 7I squared. Isn't I squared -1? So the bottom, -1, so that's -7. And then the top, so that becomes a 4I, and that becomes a -3. Okay, so let's write it in the correct order. So that would be a -3 plus 4I all over -7, right? Just switching those two up top so that it's in the correct A plus BI order. Oh, no negatives allowed downstairs. So one more time, if I change everybody's sign, that becomes a 7, that becomes a positive, that becomes a negative. So if you want to multiply the bottom by -1, multiply the top by -1, or the shortcut is I can change, if there's a top and bottom, I can just change everybody's sign. Oh, righties. No I's, no negatives downstairs. Whew. Let's see. Oh, one little more section. I was losing my voice. I think if I talk mellow, I can pull it off. Okay. Almost done with chapter 8. So, we said that I is the square root of -1. Don't say it's I. And we agreed that I squared was -1. We agreed upon those two ideas 5 minutes ago. So if someone asks about I cubed, I'd like to think of that as I squared times I to the 1, which is -1 times I, which is -I. And if someone said I to the 4th, I could think of that as I squared times I squared, which is just -1 times -1, which is 1. So the pattern with I to a power is every 4. So let me write it one more time. I is I squared is -1, I to the 3rd is -I to the 4th is 1. And then the pattern repeats. So it's all based on a pattern of 4. So I to the 8th does 4 go into it perfectly? Oh, then the answer is 1. Okay. How about I to the 36? Does 4 go into it perfectly? Yeah. Boom. So if 4 goes into it perfectly, I to the 44. Does 4 go into 44 perfectly? Yeah. 1. Okay. Well, what if 4 doesn't go into it? Well, then there's a pattern. So pick something random, like I to the 21. Okay. So I usually try and find something near 21 that 4 goes into. So what's I to the 20? 4 goes into 20. Okay, so that's a 1. Boom. So then, what happens after 1? Oh, the pattern repeats. So then the answer must be I. Oh, interesting. So just for the record, I to the 22 would have to be the next one, -1. I to the 23 would have to be the next one, -I. I to the 24 would have to be the next one, 1. Oh, 4 goes into 24 perfectly, 1. Ah, this game is making sense. So let's just do 476, and then you can handle it on your own. They say I to the 255. Okay, 255. 4 always goes into 100, so 4 goes into 200. So I'm just sort of thinking about the 55. So 476, so I to the, let's see, I to the 55. 4 goes into 52. Oh, 4 goes into 52. So since 4 goes into 52, 252, 4 goes into 252 perfectly. Ask your calculator. So that means that's 1. So I to the 253, what's after 1? I. And then I to the 254, what's after I? -1. I to the 255 must be, what's after -1? I. And then just for fun, what's after 255? I to the 256. What's after negative I? 1. Oh, 4 goes into 256, so everything is making sense. Okay. So, Chapter 8. Wow. Chapter 8. Okay. Should be able to handle 8.8 now.